There is a quiet place, older than memory, where the air moves like a slow river and the stars hang low above endless forests. Before there was a nation, before there was even a name, the United States, this land breathed softly, untouched by maps, by flags, by borders. Tonight, we return there. To the silence before the story. To the stillness that carried the first dream. Long before ships crossed the ocean or kingdoms claimed dominion, this continent was already alive, vast, green, unspoken. Mountains rose like the backs of sleeping giants. Rivers wound their way through time, shaping valleys that no one had yet named. In the open plains, wind moved like memory itself, whispering across tall grass that shimmered beneath the sun. The land was whole and quiet. Here, life existed without the noise of history. Animals walked ancient trails. The seasons moved with the patience of eternity. People had not yet drawn lines or built walls. They followed the rhythm of earth and sky. This was not yet America. It was a world of breath and balance, of rain, fire, soil, and snow. Somewhere near the northern edge of the world, a bridge of ice and land once connected Asia and North America. Across it walked the first humans who would ever touch this soil. Hunters, families, wanderers, guided by the pull of survival and curiosity. They did not know they were walking into legend. They followed the herds, the seasons, the stars. Step by step, they entered a continent that would one day become home to millions. They carried stories instead of flags, songs instead of laws. They built fires, shared food, watched the skies, and began to belong to the land. From those first footsteps grew villages, languages, and ways of knowing the earth, patient, sacred, enduring. For thousands of years, the land remained theirs, and they remained its memory. Until one day, across an ocean they had never seen, another dream began to stir, a dream of gold, of glory, of discovery. And with it came the first ripples of change, sails on the horizon, shadows on the water, and the echo of boots on unknown shores. The world was about to awaken. But for now, in this quiet before history, we linger a moment longer. Listen, can you hear it? The heartbeat beneath the soil, the murmur of time waiting to be named. Sleep now as the story of America begins, not with conquest, but with a breath. Chapter 1. The First Footsteps. The story begins in silence. Not the silence of emptiness, but of snow, wind, and ancient light. 15,000 years ago, maybe more, the earth was colder, heavier with ice. Across the top of the world, glaciers stretched like frozen oceans, connecting lands that today lie oceans apart. Between Siberia and Alaska, there was once a bridge of earth and stone, the Bering Land Bridge, born of ice and time. Across that bridge walked the first people who would ever set foot on what we now call America. They did not arrive as conquerors, they came as wanderers, hunters following the slow migration of mammoths and bison, families moving toward a promise they could not name. Imagine them under the dim light of an endless dawn. The world around them was white and quiet, the wind carrying only breath and heartbeat. Each step forward was a small defiance against the unknown, one that would echo for thousands of years. When the ice began to melt, the bridge disappeared beneath the sea, but the people remained. They spread south through wild forests and river valleys, into lands that would become home. From the Arctic tundra to the red deserts, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Over generations, the land shaped them, and they, in turn, gave the land meaning. They learned to read the stars, they built canoes that glided across still lakes, they carved tools from stone and bone, wove baskets from reeds, painted with ash and ochre. They planted corn, beans and squash, the three sisters, gifts that would feed countless generations. In time, they became many nations. The ancestral Puebloans built their homes high in the cliffs of the southwest, where stone met sky. The Mississippians raised great earthen mounds that rose from the heart of the continent, monuments to both faith and power. The Iroquois formed confederacies built on dialogue and peace. The Lakota rode the plains, following the rhythm of the buffalo. The Inuit lived where others could not, shaping life from ice, endurance from silence. Each tribe, each nation, carried its own way of seeing, not as owners of the land, but as its guardians. They told stories of the earth being born from water, of sky spirits and coyote tricksters, of ancestors who spoke through stone and wind. In their world, everything was alive, the rivers, the animals, even the fire. The land was not property, it was kin. To harm it was to wound oneself. To live upon it was to listen. Thousands of years passed like this. Seasons folding into seasons, lives flowing like rivers into the greater ocean of time. When the first Europeans later arrived, they would call these people Indians, as if one name could contain 1,000 worlds. But long before any ship crossed the Atlantic, this continent already held empires, cities, temples, and dreams. At Cahokia, near what is now Illinois, tens of thousands lived in complex societies, trading copper, shells, and stories along the Mississippi. In the southwest, the Hopi and Zuni traced their ancestry back to the first emergence from the underworld, a sacred bond with creation itself. The people were not primitive, they were ancient, and they belonged completely to this place. As centuries rolled by, the land breathed in rhythm with them. Forests renewing, rivers carving new paths, fires cleansing old growth. Theirs was a civilization written not in marble, but in memory. If you listen closely, even now you can still feel it. Beneath highways and cities, beneath the hum of electric light, the quiet pulse of the first footsteps. The echo of lives that knew how to live with the land instead of against it. They did not build empires to last forever. They built relationships that did, and somewhere in that deep, wordless bond between people and earth, the foundation of a nation was quietly laid, not yet political, not yet named, but spiritual. Because before America was a country, it was a living dream, carried by those who first crossed the ice, who first watched the sun rise over a land they would one day call home. Their journey did not end when they reached the Pacific or when the ice bridge disappeared. It continued in their children, their languages, their songs, and even as the centuries changed, as strangers would one day arrive with flags and fire, that first connection endured. It still endures. So, as night deepens and you breathe slower, imagine their fires flickering beneath the stars. Imagine the sound of soft footsteps on frozen earth, the first rhythm of America, before history, before division, before words. They walk so that one day stories could walk too. Chapter 2. The Whisper of Discovery. For thousands of years, the ocean was both wall and mystery. It stretched beyond the horizon, a vast, blue, endless, a mirror for the stars and the unknown. To the people of the old world, it was said that the sea had no end, that its edge was guarded by dragons, that the sun sank each night into a burning pit of gold. Yet there were always some who wondered, what lay beyond the last line of light? Around the year 1000, when Europe was still wrapped in shadow and superstition, a handful of wanderers followed that question. Among them was a man named Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, born of the northern wind and hardened by the cold salt of the sea. The Norse had already found Greenland, a harsh, frozen promise at the edge of survival. But Leif sailed farther still, carried by curiosity more than conquest. His ship, carved from pine and stitched with woolen sail, creaked through mists and storm. He followed the cry of seabirds, the scent of unseen land, and one morning, when the fog finally lifted, he saw it: green shorelines, wild grapes, forests deep and untouched. He called it Vinland, the land of wine. It may have been Newfoundland or Nova Scotia, or perhaps farther south. The maps are lost to time, but the memory remains. The Norse built small shelters, lit fires, shared meals. They were not alone. They met people of the land, tall, silent, cautious. There was exchange, then fear, then departure. The Northmen left as quietly as they had come, their footprints soon erased by wind and tide. And so, for centuries, the whisper faded. Vinland became a story, half dream, half truth, carried in sagas told by firelight on long Arctic nights. The world went on forgetting, but the sea never forgot. It kept the memory of those ships tucked between its waves waiting. In the centuries that followed, Europe began to change. The Middle Ages, once bound by faith and feudal lords, slowly opened its eyes. Curiosity returned, a hunger for trade, for knowledge, for the unseen corners of the earth. Sailors from Portugal traced the edges of Africa, learning the language of the wind. The compass found its way into human hands. And on parchment maps, artists drew sea monsters and angels, filling the unknown with imagination. Then came a dreamer from Genoa, Christopher Columbus, whose faith was as large as the ocean itself. He believed the world was smaller than the scholars said, that Asia could be reached not by land but by faith and westward wind. In his heart, geography and destiny were the same thing. Kings and queens listened, then hesitated. Who would pay for a dream so uncertain? But one day, a quiet yes came from Queen Isabella of Spain. In August of 1492, 3 ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, left the port of Palos under a sky the color of faded copper. Behind them, Europe whispered prayers. Ahead of them, the sea whispered back. The journey was long. Weeks passed without land. Men grew afraid. They cursed the captain, cursed the wind, cursed the silence. But Columbus kept watching the horizon, eyes fixed not on what was, but what might be. And then, one dawn, October 12th, 1492, the cry came. Tierra, land. They had reached the islands of the Caribbean, not Asia as Columbus believed, but something far older and newer all at once. A world unseen by Europe for tens of thousands of years, the beginning of contact, the beginning of change. The ocean had finally revealed its secret, not gently, but completely. With each tide that followed came more ships, more sails, more names. Spanish galleons, French explorers, English traders, all chasing something different, faith, fame, or fortune. And far away, the people who had lived here for millennia watched from the shore. To them, these new arrivals were like ghosts emerging from mist, bearing fire and iron. Some saw wonder, others saw warning. Few could imagine how much would change. For now, the world held its breath. Two civilizations, two dreams, meeting for the first time across the curve of the sea. The age of discovery had begun, but for those who listen closely, even across the centuries, the ocean still carries the first whisper, the sound of sails in fog, of hearts daring to believe that beyond the horizon, something waited. As you drift into rest, imagine that sea again, dark, infinite, patient. The oars dipping softly into the water, the sky stretching wide above. Each ripple is a heartbeat of history, each gust of wind a breath of destiny. And in that timeless silence, the world is about to awaken. Chapter 3. The Age of Exploration. The ocean, once a whisper, had become a calling. And when one man answered, the whole world followed. After Columbus returned to Spain, carrying with him tales of golden islands and gentle people, Europe began to stir with fevered dreams. Maps were redrawn, thrones leaned forward. The horizon was no longer the end, it was an invitation. The year was still young in history's heart, yet the world was already shifting beneath it. Spain moved first, sending explorers across the Caribbean and the mainland beyond. They came with banners bearing the cross, with muskets and armor that gleamed beneath the tropical sun. Among them were men like Hernán Cortés, who marched into the heart of the Aztec Empire, and Francisco Pizarro, who crossed the Andes in search of Inca gold. They brought with them faith and fear, conquest and contagion. Behind their victories lay entire civilizations that vanished into silence. The New World, as they called it, was not new at all. It had been old and alive for millennia, but to Europe it was a mirror in which they saw both their ambitions and their reflection. Bright, restless, and hungry. From the Caribbean, Spain's empire spread like sunlight across the coasts. They built cathedrals in Mexico, fortresses in Florida, missions in California. They mined silver, planted sugar, and baptized entire peoples in names not their own. Each ship that returned to Europe carried gold and stories, and each story carried the scent of more. In the north, the French sailed too. Men like Jacques Cartier and Samuel de Champlain followed the St. Lawrence River, tracing misty paths into the heart of a continent unknown to them. They traded furs, learned languages, and built alliances with the native nations. To them, America was not only land, it was a vast communion of rivers, forests, and souls. And to the east, the English watched, cautious, calculating, patient. Their first attempts were fragile. Roanoke, a settlement that vanished without a word, leaving only the carving Croatoan on a wooden post. But the dream did not die. In 1607 they founded Jamestown, a small outpost in the swamps of Virginia, where smoke from the first English fires mingled with the cries of distant birds. They came not as conquerors, but as survivors, merchants, farmers, seekers. The air was heavy with heat and disease, the soil was harsh, the winters cruel. But they endured. And beneath the suffering, a strange seed began to take root. The idea that a new world could also mean a new beginning. For the Dutch, the New World became a harbor of trade. They built New Amsterdam at the mouth of a wide river, today called the Hudson, where merchants' voices echoed in many tongues. Ships carried goods, ideas, and dreams across waters that were once only feared. The world had become smaller, yet infinitely larger in imagination. Every nation sought something different: silver, spices, salvation. But beneath it all was a single pulse: curiosity. The same restless whisper that once guided Leif Erikson through the fog now filled every sail on every sea. Yet exploration was not gentle. Alongside maps and marvels came chains and musket fire. Wherever European flags rose, old worlds trembled. The meeting of two civilizations was not a handshake, it was a collision. Still, amid the clash, there were moments of wonder. When Spanish friars learned native tongues to translate prayers, when French traders shared tobacco by a river with Algonquin hunters, when English settlers looked up at the stars and realized they were under a different sky, yet the same creation. The explorers wrote of it all, of endless forests that hummed like cathedrals, of mountains taller than belief, of skies so wide they seemed to have no ceiling. Their letters crossed the sea like sparks in the dark, igniting the imagination of Europe. And behind every story was a truth deeper than ambition. The world was one body, finally touching itself again. After tens of thousands of years apart, humanity had reunited, not in peace, but in presence. As the century turned, the Atlantic became a road of return, carrying settlers, soldiers, priests, and slaves. A triangle of trade was born, binding 3 continents in a web of suffering and survival. The ocean that once whispered discovery now murmured of debt and consequence. But for now, in this chapter of beginnings, the wind still smells of salt and promise. The sails still shine beneath the moon. The world is still young enough to believe that every landfall is a miracle, and that somewhere beyond the horizon, there is always another morning. As you breathe slower, imagine those ships in the twilight, wooden ribs creaking, lanterns glowing against the fog, the sea rocking them like a cradle. The explorers sleep under unfamiliar stars, dreaming of home, dreaming of empire, dreaming of the unknown. And in their dreams, a new world begins to stir. Chapter 4. The Seeds of Settlement. The story of settlement begins not with triumph, but with hunger. In the spring of 1607, 3 English ships, Susan Constant, Godspeed, and Discovery, drifted up a wide, muddy river they would later name the James. The land smelled of salt and pine. The air was thick with the promise of summer and the murmur of insects. Somewhere beyond the trees, unseen eyes were watching. They called the place Jamestown after their king, but in truth it was no kingdom, only a clearing in the wilderness surrounded by marsh and uncertainty. The settlers, about 100 men and boys, built their fort from timber and faith. They came searching for gold, for glory, for a quick road to riches. Instead, they found heat, disease, and despair. The first year was cruel. Water turned foul, crops refused to grow, and half of them perished. Some whispered prayers, others cursed the ocean that had brought them. In that wilderness, survival was no longer a dream. It was the only commandment. And yet the land, silent, immense, seemed to watch them patiently, as if testing their will. It was here that Captain John Smith, a soldier of restless spirit, began to lead. He traded with the Powhatan people, learned their ways, and discovered something greater than gold, the necessity of cooperation. Among those who watched him was Pocahontas, the daughter of the Powhatan chief, a symbol later wrapped in myth but once a real bridge between two worlds trying to understand each other. Over time, the colony steadied itself. Tobacco, the plant the natives had long cultivated, became its lifeline. The fields filled with green leaves that shimmered under the Virginian sun, and ships began carrying them back to England like bundles of hope. Jamestown had survived, not because it conquered, but because it learned to adapt. Across the sea, another voyage was preparing, not of merchants, but of believers. In 1620, a small ship named the Mayflower left England, carrying 100 souls seeking something deeper than fortune, faith and freedom. They called themselves pilgrims, and they dreamed of a land where conscience could breathe. The journey was brutal. Storms tore their sails, sickness claimed their bodies, but on a cold November morning they sighted land, not Virginia as planned, but a rocky coast farther north. They stepped ashore at Plymouth, wrapped in wool and prayer, and fell to their knees on frozen sand. Winter came quickly and without mercy. Half of them would not live to see spring. Yet, when warmth returned, so did grace, in the form of strangers who would save them. The Wampanoag people, led by Massasoit and guided by a man named Squanto who spoke English, taught them how to plant corn, fish the rivers, and trust the seasons. From this bond grew something fragile yet enduring, the first shared harvest, later remembered as Thanksgiving. It was not yet a holiday nor a myth of harmony, but a moment of shared humanity in a world both brutal and beautiful. In the years that followed, more ships arrived, not in handfuls, but in hundreds. Families, artisans, farmers, dreamers. They brought tools, seeds, Bibles, and memories of a homeland they might never see again. The wilderness softened under their touch. Forests gave way to villages. Villages grew into towns. Church bells began to ring across the cold Atlantic wind. And yet, beneath it all, tension stirred, between those who sought freedom and those who sought profit, between the new settlers and the people who had long called this place home. The early colonies were small lights in a vast darkness, but together they began to flicker with rhythm. Virginia, Massachusetts, Maryland, Pennsylvania. Each one a different dream, stitched together by distance and faith. In New England, life was ordered and communal. The Puritans built their towns around meeting houses and schools, believing that education and scripture would keep them close to God. In the South, plantations spread like rivers of green, tended by hands that would one day be enslaved. And in between, in the middle colonies, trade, diversity, and tolerance began to grow. America, though unborn, was already breathing, unevenly, painfully, but undeniably alive. At night, the settlers would look up at the stars, the same stars their ancestors had seen across the ocean, and wonder if they had made the right choice. The air smelled of wood smoke and earth. Wolves howled in the distance. But in their hearts, something stirred. The sense that they were part of something greater than themselves. A new world was not built in a day. It was planted like a seed in hardship, faith, and quiet endurance. The first roots of a nation were not political, they were human. They were the hands that built shelters, the prayers whispered in sickness, the small fires that refused to go out through long winters. So as you drift into rest, imagine those lights. The flicker of lanterns in tiny cabins scattered across a vast unknown. Each flame a heartbeat of hope, each ember a promise that someday this wilderness would become a home. And in that soft glow of survival, the seeds of America began to grow. Chapter 5: The Growing Colonies. By the mid-1600s, the wilderness had begun to speak in many tongues. The forests that once echoed with only the call of birds now carried the sound of axes, church bells, and human laughter. Villages became towns, towns became colonies, and the colonies began to see themselves not as wanderers, but as people of a new world. The land was still rough, still wild, but it was alive with motion.
Every spring, ships arrived from England, their decks heavy with passengers, livestock, and hope.
Every autumn, wagons creaked down dirt roads filled with grain, timber, and dreams of another year survived. There were now 13 colonies stretching along the Atlantic coast, each shaped by its own soul. To the north lay New England, cold, stern, and devout, where Puritans built towns around steeples and schoolhouses. Life there was hard but orderly, the winters long but full of prayer. To work was to serve God, and to read was to honor Him. Children learned their letters by candlelight, their small voices repeating the Psalms as snow fell against wooden shutters. Farther south lay the middle colonies, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, a tapestry of languages and beliefs. Here lived Quakers, Germans, Dutch, Scots, and Swedes, people drawn by the promise of tolerance. Markets were busy, ships moved in and out of bustling harbors, and wheat fields rippled in the wind like quiet seas of gold. The people worked the land, traded furs, and debated God with gentle conviction. And farther still, kind in the southern colonies, warmth wrapped the land in green. Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia were wide stretches of soil, fed by rivers and sunlight. Plantations rose along the tidewater, their owners writing letters in ink while enslaved hands worked the earth. Tobacco, rice, and indigo flowed across the ocean, making fortunes for a few and chains for many. Here, America was already divided, not yet by borders, but by the rhythm of its labor. In the north, small farms and family trades. In the south, vast estates sustained by human suffering. The contrast would deepen quietly beneath the hum of daily life. But the colonies were more than their economies. They were ideas made visible, tiny experiments in belief and endurance. In Massachusetts, the Puritans pursued holiness with discipline and fear. In Pennsylvania, William Penn's vision of peace gave birth to a place where no man would be persecuted for faith. In Maryland, Catholics found refuge. In Rhode Island, dissenters found a voice. Each colony was a fragment of a larger dream, that people could build a world of their own choosing. Everywhere, life followed the slow rhythm of seasons: spring planting, summer work, autumn harvest, winter prayer. Children grew, married, and inherited the same patch of land their fathers had tamed. The colonies began to weave a quiet stability. Fragile, yes, but real. Still, even in this calm, tension flickered. The Atlantic was wide, yet not wide enough to silence the reach of the crown. England watched from afar, counting its profits and asserting its laws. The colonies, meanwhile, began to sense their own identity, faint like the first light before dawn.
They had fought hunger, built roads, planted orchards, written laws.
They had paid taxes and shed tears, buried loved ones and raised children in freedom's shadow. And though they called themselves English, something in them had already begun to change. They no longer bowed easily. In taverns, men gathered to read pamphlets and share news from London. They spoke of liberty, of the rights of men, of new ideas whispered by philosophers across the sea. Locke, Montesquieu, Rousseau. They did not yet call it revolution, but they could feel it, like thunder beyond the horizon. The press became their weapon. Colonial newspapers printed stories of Parliament's decrees and the people's dissent. Each issue spread faster than the ships that carried it, passing from hand to hand, voice to voice, until entire towns began to think as one. Churches filled with prayer, but also with questions. How far does obedience go? If every man is made in the image of God, is he not also free? The Great Awakening swept across the colonies in the 1730s and 40s, a movement of fiery sermons and trembling hearts. It called people to personal faith, not authority. It stirred emotion, passion, and the idea that no king or priest could stand between a soul and its creator. It was, quietly, the birth of an independent spirit. By the mid-17th century, the colonies were no longer mere outposts of Europe. They were bustling, breathing societies. Young, ambitious, self-aware. Ships from Boston carried rum to Africa and sugar from the Caribbean. Farmers from Pennsylvania sent grain to the world. Craftsmen from Virginia built carriages and pride. And above it all, the forest still whispered, the rivers still sang, as if watching the human story unfold again. A story of courage, greed, faith, and longing. The people worked, prayed, married, and mourned, unaware that history was already leaning toward them. That within a single generation, they would be called to define not just a colony, but a country. As night deepens, imagine walking through one of those towns. The streets are narrow and lit by lanterns. You can hear a fiddle playing somewhere behind an open window, the laughter of children chasing fireflies, the creak of a cart rolling home. Above, the stars are the same ones that guided ships across the Atlantic. Silent witnesses to everything. For now, all is calm. But beneath that calm, the soil of America is moving, softly, inevitably. The colonies have learned to grow. Soon, they will learn to speak. Chapter 6. Voices of Change. The colonies had grown in number, in wealth, in pride. But something else was growing too. Something unseen. Something that could not be measured in land or gold. It was a restlessness of the mind, a whisper that said, there must be more. Across the ocean, Europe was awakening. The Age of Enlightenment, a time when scholars, writers, and dreamers began to question everything once considered unchangeable. They spoke of reason, of natural law, of human rights not granted by kings, but born with every soul. They wrote by candlelight, their quills scratching across parchment, as if chiseling open the very walls of history. And those words, fragile as they seemed, crossed the sea. They arrived in the colonies, tucked in books, sermons, and letters. They were read by merchants in Boston, by planters in Virginia, by students in Philadelphia. Ideas became contraband. Dangerous, luminous, alive. The Enlightenment taught that truth was not inherited but discovered. That government was a contract, not a divine right. That knowledge was a light no darkness could hold forever. In these ideas, the colonists saw reflections of their own struggles. They had built their towns by hand, governed themselves in distant isolation, and learned that survival required cooperation, not decree. They began to believe that perhaps they did not need a distant crown to rule them. But not all change came from books. Some came from the heart. In the 1730s, a great wave of emotion swept the colonies, a spiritual revival that would come to be known as the Great Awakening. Preachers like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield filled the air with trembling sermons that stirred both fear and hope. They called people not to churches or kings, but to the still, small voice within their souls. Under tents, in meadows, in the open air, thousands gathered. They wept, shouted, prayed. Men and women, slaves and free, all stood together, not as classes or ranks, but as human beings hungry for meaning. The message was simple, yet revolutionary. Salvation was personal. Authority was not eternal. Every person had worth, and the right to speak, to think, to choose. In the taverns, newspapers, and small schools scattered across the colonies, those two forces, reason and faith, began to intertwine. They were not enemies, but companions, forming the early voice of what would one day be called the American spirit.
Newspapers became the pulse of this awakening mind.
They printed essays, debates, and announcements of public lectures. Pamphlets passed from hand to hand, small, cheap, and potent. Each one a spark, a challenge, a question. Who are we? In the city of Philadelphia, a man named Benjamin Franklin became the symbol of this new curiosity. Printer, inventor, writer, diplomat. He embodied the idea that the human mind was limitless if given freedom to explore. He founded libraries and scientific societies, published almanacs filled with wit and wisdom, and believed that education was the truest wealth a nation could have. An investment in knowledge, he once said, pays the best interest. Those words would outlive him. Meanwhile, in schools and meeting houses, a new generation grew up that had never seen England, children who spoke of the colonies as home. To them, London was a rumour, the Atlantic a wall. They prayed in their own churches, read their own books, made their own laws. And though they still called themselves British, their hearts were already somewhere else, somewhere freer, more uncertain, more alive. The colonies had become a network of thought and trade. Merchants in Boston wrote to traders in Charleston. Printers in New York exchanged essays with philosophers in Paris. The world was shrinking and the American mind was expanding. It was as if the land itself, vast, untamed, brimming with horizon, had begun to teach its people something, that liberty, like wilderness, cannot be owned. Still, not everyone was ready for change. Loyalists clung to the stability of empire, church leaders feared the loss of order, and many ordinary settlers, weary from work and survival, only wanted peace. But history, like a tide, does not ask for permission. It moves, slow but certain, pulling all who live within its reach. By the mid-18th century, a new kind of confidence stirred in the colonies. They built universities, published scientific discoveries, painted portraits, composed music, and debated philosophy. They had moved beyond survival. Now they sought identity.
And though they did not yet call it independence, the thought had begun to bloom. Quiet, persistent, inevitable.
At night, under the same stars that guided their ancestors, men sat on porches and spoke in low voices. They spoke of fairness, of laws, of a world where distance did not mean obedience. They spoke of education and faith and the strange feeling that destiny was beginning to turn its face toward them. The air was changing, not in temperature, but in thought. And from that invisible shift, 1,000 small awakenings began, in homes, in hearts, in the hidden corners of the mind. As you breathe slower, imagine the glow of candlelight flickering through small colonial windows, the scratch of quills, the murmured prayers, the faint hum of an age beginning to understand itself. The world was no longer asleep. The colonies were listening. And the voices of change, quiet, fragile, beautiful, had begun to sing. Chapter 7: The Gathering Storm. Every storm begins with a change in the wind. For the American colonies, that wind began to shift after a war, one they had fought not for themselves, but for their king. In 1763, the French and Indian War ended. It had lasted 7 long years, fought across the forests and rivers of a continent that neither France nor England truly understood. The British won, but victory came heavy, with debt, with pride, and with the illusion that control could stretch across an ocean. The colonists had fought bravely, believing that courage would earn respect. They had marched beside red-coated soldiers, built forts, and defended frontiers. They thought they were partners in empire, but when the guns went silent, they discovered they were still servants. To pay for the war, Parliament turned its gaze westward, toward the colonies. Taxes were passed, laws imposed, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act, each one a stone laid upon the growing weight of resentment. To London, it was simple accounting. To America, it was an insult whispered across the sea. For years, the colonists had governed themselves quietly and capably. Now they were told that every contract, every newspaper, even every deck of cards must carry the king's seal, paid for in sterling, not sweat. The cry began softly, like the murmur before rain. No taxation without representation. A phrase, simple and small but heavy enough to bend history. In taverns and meeting houses, the people began to talk, not of rebellion, not yet, but of fairness, of dignity. Pamphlets were printed and passed from hand to hand, each one a spark in the dry field of public anger. Newspapers carried words that once would have been whispered. In Boston, merchants refused to unload British ships. Women gathered to spin their own cloth, refusing imported goods. Ordinary people, farmers, blacksmiths, printers, began to see themselves not as subjects, but as citizens. And then, in 1770, the first drops of blood fell. A cold March evening, snow on cobblestone, a crowd shouting in the dark. British soldiers, nervous, outnumbered, raise their muskets. A crack, a flash, a scream. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists lay dead. It would be called the Boston Massacre, though the name came later, crafted by men who knew that words could wound more deeply than bullets. Among those men was Samuel Adams, who turned outrage into movement, sorrow into unity. He helped form the committees of correspondence, threads of communication that stitched the 13 colonies together like patches on a flag not yet sewn. 3 years later, the tension boiled again. A new tax on tea, small, almost symbolic, became the final straw. One night in December 1773, as the harbour froze under moonlight, a group of men disguised as Mohawk warriors boarded ships anchored in Boston. They worked quietly, methodically, breaking open chests and pouring their contents into the sea. The salt water turned dark with tea. The scent rose like incense. It was an offering, not to gods, but to liberty. The next morning, the harbour was calm again, as if nothing had happened. But the world had changed. The king's patience had ended. London called it vandalism. The colonies called it a message. The coercive acts followed, punishment swift and severe. Boston's port was closed, soldiers occupied its streets, and the city grew silent except for the sound of boots and drums. But silence does not mean surrender, it means listening. And across the colonies, hearts were listening to something deeper than fear, a rhythm that had begun long ago beneath the soil, in the seed of every dream of freedom. In 1774, delegates from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia. Men from north and south, farmers and philosophers, ministers and merchants. They met not as subjects but as equals, forming the First Continental Congress. In that meeting hall, beneath wooden beams and candle smoke, a nation took its first breath. They spoke of boycotts, of petitions, of rights. They were still loyal, still cautious, still bound to hope that reason might prevail. But in their voices, something new began to sound: conviction. By spring of 1775, the storm that had been gathering for years could no longer be contained. British troops marched to seize colonial weapons stored in Concord, unaware that farmers and blacksmiths stood waiting. Shots were fired in the early light of April 19th. No one remembers who pulled the trigger first, but the echo of that single musket shot rolled across the land, across the ocean, across centuries. Ralph Waldo Emerson would later call it the shot heard round the world. The war had begun, not for land,
not for gold,
but for the right to decide who they were. The colonies had no army, no treasury, no flag. But they had something older than all of that: faith in their own courage and the quiet certainty that liberty, once awakened, cannot be silenced again. The storm had gathered, and in its roar was not destruction, but birth. As you close your eyes, imagine the flicker of torches in the night, the scent of rain and gunpowder, the murmur of voices rising in unison for the first time.
It is the sound of a people about to find themselves.
The world trembles but does not yet know why. The dawn of revolution waits just beyond the hills. And in that stillness before thunder, a new nation begins to dream. Chapter 8: The Spark of Revolution. The dawn was pale when it began, April 19th, 1775. Mist lay low over the Massachusetts countryside, soft and blue, like the breath of sleep not yet broken. In the village of Lexington, the church bell rang. Not for prayer this time, but for warning. Farmers left their beds, pulling on coats and boots, still damp with dew. They were not soldiers, they were husbands, fathers, craftsmen.
They stood in a rough line on the village green, their hearts louder than their muskets.
Across the field, the red coats of the British glimmered like spilled fire. For a long moment there was silence, the kind that lives between two worlds. Then came a single shot. No one would ever know who fired it, but it cracked the stillness of history open. The air filled with smoke and confusion, the ground trembled with running feet, and in that fleeting chaos the first blood of revolution was spilled. 8 colonists fell, the rest scattered into the trees, not defeated, only awakened. The British marched on to Concord, where more farmers waited by the North Bridge. The morning sun had risen fully now, catching on the barrels of muskets, on the river, on the faces of men who realized that life would never again be what it was yesterday. When the redcoats turned back toward Boston, the roads behind them were lined with militia. Ordinary men who had become something else entirely. The revolution had begun. Quietly. Inevitably. As if the world had been holding its breath for that one moment of release. News of the battles raced through the colonies like fire through dry grass. Riders galloped along muddy roads, their horses lathered, their voices shouting into the wind, "The war has started! The war has started!" By summer, delegates once again gathered in Philadelphia, in the same hall where they had pleaded for peace the year before. But now the air was different. The scent of fear had been replaced by the sharp tang of purpose. They called themselves the Second Continental Congress, still loyal to the king, at least in name, but already walking a road that would lead far beyond him. They debated for days. Voices rising, tempers flaring, hearts torn between caution and courage. Some still hoped for reconciliation. Others, like John Adams and Patrick Henry, knew the truth that a people cannot unlearn freedom once they have tasted it. Out of that gathering came the decision to create an army, not of one colony, but of all. And at its head they chose a man whose presence carried the calm of mountains and the patience of stone, George Washington of Virginia. He was tall, quiet, deliberate. When he spoke, men listened. When he rode through camp, soldiers straightened without being told. He accepted the command not as a glory, but as a burden. "I fear," he wrote, "that I am unequal to the task." But he would bear it anyway.
That summer, under a sky heavy with smoke and promise, the Continental Army was born.
They were farmers with borrowed muskets, blacksmiths turned soldiers, boys who had never marched in formation. Their uniforms did not match, their supplies were scarce, and yet their resolve was unbreakable. They gathered outside Boston, where the British held the city. There in June came the Battle of Bunker Hill, a brutal contest of fire and endurance. The colonists fought from behind earthen walls until their ammunition ran dry. When they finally retreated, more than 1,000 British soldiers lay wounded or dead. It was not a victory, but it was a revelation. The mightiest army in the world could bleed. As months turned to years, the war spread across valleys, across mines. Some remained loyal to the crown, others risked everything for the cause of liberty. Neighbors became strangers. Families divided. But through the struggle ran a single thread of belief that freedom was worth any cost. In the winter of 1775, pamphlets began to appear in the hands of common people. Thin, plain, powerful. One was called Common Sense, written by Thomas Paine, a man whose pen could pierce like a blade. He wrote that kings were not chosen by God, that nations had the right to govern themselves, and that America was not a colony. It was an idea waiting to be born. "'Tis time to part," he declared. And the people listened. Farmers read his words aloud by firelight.
Sailors carried them from port to port.
The pamphlets spread faster than armies, and where it went, hesitation began to fade. By the spring of 1776, the colonies were no longer whispering rebellion. They were ready to speak its name. The Congress met again in Philadelphia, the air thick with summer heat and history. In those crowded rooms beneath fans made of feathers and parchment, they debated the unthinkable: separation. Richard Henry Lee of Virginia rose and spoke the words that changed everything. "These united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states."
A silence followed, deep and trembling. Then, one by one, the men nodded.
It was time. Outside, the city moved as always, carts creaking, children playing, church bells marking the hour. But inside that hall, the world was shifting on its axis. The spark that had ignited in Lexington now burned through every heart in the room. The question was no longer if there would be a nation, but how it would be born. And somewhere, in a quiet corner, a young Virginian with thoughtful eyes began to write. His quill would soon carve words that would echo through centuries. words of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But that is another chapter. As you rest, imagine those long days in Philadelphia. The open windows letting in the hum of summer, the sweat of conviction on every brow, the flicker of candles bending over blank parchment. Outside, the air trembles with thunder, but inside, history learns to breathe. The spark of revolution has been struck, and the world, for the first time, begins to see the glow of America's first light. Chapter 9: The Birth of a Nation.
The air in Philadelphia that summer was thick, with heat, with dust, with the weight of destiny.
The year was 1776, and the city moved as it always had. Horses clattering over cobblestone, children chasing one another through narrow streets, church bells marking the passing hours. But within the walls of the Pennsylvania State House, something extraordinary was taking shape. 46 men sat in that room, merchants, farmers, lawyers, ministers, ordinary men carrying an impossible task. They had come not to petition, but to proclaim. The time for pleading was over. The time for courage had begun. On a wooden table near the window where sunlight fell across ink and parchment, a young Virginian bent over his writing. His name was Thomas Jefferson, and his pen moved like a quiet current, steady and sure. The sound of the quill scratching across the page was the sound of a nation being born. He wrote of truths that needed no king to approve them. He wrote that all men are created equal, not as a gift, but as a fact, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that when any form of government becomes destructive to those ends, the people have the right and the duty to alter or abolish it. The words flowed with the simplicity of conviction. They were not written in anger, but in faith. Faith that freedom, once spoken, could not be unsaid. For days the delegates argued, revised, and voted. Each man knew that signing this document was an act of treason punishable by death, but one by one their hands steadied, and on July 4th, 1776, they signed their names beneath Jefferson's words. In that instant, the United States of America existed, not yet in body, but in spirit. It was still fragile, unproven, and surrounded by empire, yet within those few pages lay a revolution, not just of politics, but of philosophy. The idea that power was not inherited, but earned, not decreed, but chosen. Outside the hall, church bells began to ring. In the streets, people gathered, reading the news aloud. The parchment itself was carried from town to town, its words echoing through courthouses, taverns, and public squares. Wherever it went, hearts lifted. Men removed their hats. Women wept quietly. Children listened, not yet understanding, but feeling that something holy had happened. The colonies were no longer colonies.
They were a people, united not by geography but by belief.
Yet even as the ink dried, the reality of war pressed close. The British army still marched, ships still filled the harbours. The signers knew that the world would not simply bow to their words. Freedom must be defended line by line, life by life. But they also knew something deeper, that once an idea is born, no army can kill it. John Adams, writing to his wife Abigail, said that this day would be celebrated with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations. He imagined fireworks bursting in the sky long after he was gone. And he was right. For more than 2 centuries, those lights would still bloom each July, not as explosions of war, but as the remembrance of awakening.
Across the land, the declaration travelled like fire through dry fields.
Soldiers in torn coats listened as it was read aloud beneath the stars. They stood shoeless, hungry, and weary, yet when they heard the words, something inside them straightened. They were no longer fighting for taxes or trade. They were fighting for the right to stand upright, to speak, to belong to no crown but their conscience. At Independence Square, crowds gathered around the bell tower. When the last words were read, we mutually pledged to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. The Liberty Bell rang out. Its sound rolled across the city, through windows and alleys, through hearts and history. They said its crack appeared later, but perhaps it was always there. A reminder that freedom, like the bell, is beautiful because it is imperfect. Not everyone celebrated. Some feared what they had unleashed: war, division, chaos. Others, enslaved or displaced, wondered when those words of equality would belong to them, too. The Declaration was not the end of struggle, but the beginning of a promise that would take generations to keep. And yet there was something pure in that moment, a clarity rare in human history. A nation had declared not its power, but its principles. It was not founded on conquest, but on conscience. In that quiet hall, amid ink and sweat and trembling hands, humanity had written its own permission to be free. As the day faded, candles burned low and the air cooled. The men who had signed their names stepped into the streets, looking up at a sky full of stars. Perhaps they wondered if the world would remember. Perhaps they were too tired to think at all. But the world did remember, and that parchment, fragile, worn, human, would outlive every empire that once towered above it. So as you drift into rest, imagine that old wooden room. The scent of ink and paper, the rustle of coats, the trembling of a single candle flame that refused to die. Outside, the night was vast, but inside, something eternal had begun to glow. The world would never be the same.
Because on that July morning, freedom found its voice.
And a nation, still learning to breathe, took its first breath. Chapter 10. The War for Freedom. The parchment had been signed, but words alone could not make a nation. Freedom, once declared, had to be defended, in mud, in snow, in hunger. The summer of 1776 burned bright and uncertain. In New York, General George Washington stood upon the hills of Brooklyn, watching the sea darken with the silhouettes of British ships. Hundreds of sails, white as bone, spread across the water like ghosts.
The empire had come to reclaim its wayward children.
The city fell, then the forts. Then the confidence of an army too new to understand defeat. Washington retreated across New Jersey, his men silent, their boots leaving blood in the snow. Some called him a failure, but he did not break. He understood that freedom is not won in one battle, but in endurance. So he crossed the Delaware River on a night so cold the water itself seemed to hold its breath. The ice cracked beneath the boats, lanterns flickered against the wind, and the soldiers rowed without words. At dawn they struck, swift and desperate, surprising the enemy at Trenton. For the first time, victory tasted real. Small but alive, like the first flame of a long winter fire, the war stretched on year after year. Cities burned, alliances shifted.
The cause that began in ink was now written in blood.
Washington's army was not glorious. They lacked food, shoes, and sometimes even hope. They marched through frost and mud, following a man who asked of them not loyalty, but courage. At Valley Forge, the winter of 1777 came with ice and silence. The snow covered everything. Tents, cannons, dreams. Men wrapped their feet in rags, burned fences for warmth, prayed for bread that did not come. Yet somehow they stayed. They trained, they drilled, they believed. A Prussian officer named Baron von Steuben arrived to teach them discipline, not with cruelty, but with precision, shaping them into something new. An army of purpose. By spring, when the snow melted, the men who emerged from Valley Forge were different. They were leaner, stronger, unified. They had suffered together. And suffering, when shared, becomes strength. Beyond the Atlantic, the world was watching. In Paris, philosophers and politicians whispered about the audacity of the colonies. One of them, a king who once ruled absolute, saw an opportunity. France decided to stand beside America. Ships crossed the ocean carrying soldiers, muskets, and hope. Among them was a young nobleman with a heart too restless for luxury, Marquis de Lafayette. He became as a son to Washington, his youth balancing the old general's quiet gravity. Together they began to believe that this impossible dream might yet live. The years dragged on. Battles were won, then lost. Fortunes turned like the wind. The war was not one of glory, but of persistence. Every victory was followed by hunger, every defeat by resolve. The people at home bore their own burdens, mothers tending fields alone, blacksmiths forging bayonets by candlelight, children learning that liberty demanded not comfort, but endurance. They gave because they believed. And belief, once awakened, cannot sleep again. By 1781, the tide began to turn. British General Cornwallis, weary from years of pursuit, encamped his army at Yorktown, Virginia, by the sea. He thought the ocean would protect him. But the ocean for once had chosen sides. Washington moved swiftly, joining forces with Lafayette and the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse. They surrounded Yorktown from land and sea, a slow, tightening circle of inevitability. The nights were long and tense, filled with cannon thunder and the distant cry of drums. The smell of gunpowder mingled with salt air. And when dawn came on October 19th, the Redcoats marched out in silence. Their drums beat a funeral rhythm as they stacked their weapons and bowed their flags. The war was not yet officially over, but the spirit of empire had broken. Freedom, once a whisper, now stood on its own feet. In Paris, 2 years later, the peace was signed. Across the ocean, church bells rang and tears fell freely. The United States of America, barely born, barely surviving, was now real. A nation not of conquest but of conviction. Washington rode back to his home at Mount Vernon not as a king or conqueror, but as a man tired and humble. He stepped off his horse, looked across the fields of his youth, and laid his sword aside. He had led a revolution and asked for no crown. Perhaps that was his greatest act. The cost had been unimaginable: lives, towns, years of uncertainty. But what remained was something enduring. The belief that ordinary people, joined by courage, could change the course of history. The war for freedom was never about destroying the old. It was about creating the space for something new. A nation built not on bloodlines but on belief, not on permission but on purpose. As you close your eyes, imagine the quiet that came after the last cannon fell silent. The fields once filled with smoke now glowed with moonlight. Soldiers slept beneath open skies, their dreams lighter than their memories. And somewhere, perhaps in Mount Vernon, an aging general sat by his hearth, the flames reflected in his eyes, weary, peaceful, grateful. He had seen the darkness of war and the dawn of freedom. And in that stillness, beneath the hum of a newborn world, he knew. The hardest battles are not those fought with muskets, but those fought within the human spirit, between fear and faith, despair and endurance. Sleep now as the echoes of that war fade into time. The guns are silent. The dream remains. The fire that once burned for freedom still glows, quietly, within every human heart. Chapter 11. Building a Government. The war had ended, but peace was not simple. The fields were quiet now, the rivers clear again, but the country that emerged from the smoke was fragile, like a newborn child, trembling yet alive. The soldiers had gone home, the generals had laid down their swords, and the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if freedom could survive the silence. For the first time, there was no king, no crown, no empire, only the people. Millions of souls scattered across vast wilderness, bound not by force but by hope. They had won independence, but they had yet to learn how to be united. The first attempt came in 1781. A thin, imperfect thread called the Articles of Confederation. It was less a government than a handshake, a promise among 13 sovereign states to stand together, yet each guarding its own power. Congress could make laws but not enforce them. It could ask for taxes but not collect them. It could call for unity but not command it. And yet, in that frail structure, something beautiful flickered. Trust. A belief that reason, not rule, could guide men. It was a noble experiment, and like all experiments, it began to fail. The war had left scars, debts to pay, borders to draw, alliances to mend. The new nation was poor, divided, and uncertain.
Farmers in Massachusetts rose up in revolt when they could not pay their taxes. A desperate cry known as Shays' Rebellion.
The very republic they had fought to create now seemed on the verge of collapsing under its own freedom. George Washington, retired to his fields at Mount Vernon, watched all this with quiet concern. He had hoped to live out his days in peace, to listen to the river and let the years pass softly. But the call of duty never truly fades. He wrote to his friends warning that liberty without order is like a flame without a lantern. It burns, but it cannot last. By 1787 it was clear a new foundation was needed. So once more the delegates gathered, again in Philadelphia, again in summer, again in that hall where nations seemed to form from air and ink. The Constitutional Convention began with uncertainty. The windows were shut against the noise of the city. The air inside was thick with heat, sweat, and history. 55 men debated for months. Not soldiers this time, but architects of ideas. There was James Madison, young, thoughtful, precise, the mind behind the vision. There was Alexander Hamilton, brilliant and restless, dreaming of strength. There was Benjamin Franklin, old now, his wisdom like soft thunder in the room. And there was Washington, chosen once again to preside, silent but steady, the nation's anchor. They argued about everything, about power and balance, about liberty and law, about how much trust could be placed in human nature. They feared tyranny, but they also feared chaos. They wanted government strong enough to endure, yet restrained enough to serve. Days turned to weeks, weeks into months. Tempers rose, dreams clashed. At times, it seemed the experiment would end before it began. But one by one, compromises were shaped. Imperfect, fragile, human. A system of checks and balances.
A Congress divided into two houses.
An executive branch led by one, not a king but a servant. They wrote of rights, of justice, of the common good. And though not every voice was heard, though women, slaves, and the poor still lived outside its promises, the document that emerged carried within it the seed of something eternal. The belief that liberty, however incomplete, must always expand. On September 17, 1787, when the final draft was signed, Franklin, frail, half-deaf, his hands trembling, pointed to a carving of the sun on the back of Washington's chair. He said, "I have often looked at that sun behind the president. I could not tell if it was rising or setting, but now I know it is a rising sun."
When the Constitution was sent to the states, fear returned.
Many resisted. They worried about power once again concentrating in the hands of a few. So to ease their hearts, the Bill of Rights was promised. 10 simple amendments to guard the soul of freedom. Freedom of speech, of faith, of press, of assembly, of conscience. The right to be heard, to be secure, to be treated as human. It was not perfection, but it was direction, the moral compass of a nation learning to navigate its own vastness. And then, as if history itself exhaled, the people ratified it. The United States of America had now not only a name, but a framework, not of domination, but of dialogue. A structure built not on fear of power, but on faith in balance. As the delegates departed Philadelphia, they carried with them more than parchment. They carried a fragile hope that reason and compassion could coexist, that liberty could be shaped without losing its soul. Washington returned to Mount Vernon once more, thinking perhaps his work was done, but the country had one last need of him. To guide it, not through war, but through peace. As you breathe slowly, imagine those men stepping out into the fading light of September, their coats heavy with dust, their minds heavy with wonder. The city hums beyond the walls,
the sun dips low over the rooftops.
And in the stillness of that golden hour, a government is born. Not through conquest,
but through compromise, patience, and belief.
They did not know what the future would hold, only that they had built something worth hoping for. And sometimes, hope is the most powerful law of all. Chapter 12. The Birth of the Constitution. When the delegates left Philadelphia in the fall of 1787, the air carried both relief and uncertainty. They had written something that had never existed before, a government built not on bloodline, but on balance, not on faith in a ruler, but on faith in reason. It was bold, fragile, and unfinished. The ink was barely dry when the arguments began. In taverns, meeting houses, and printed pamphlets, voices rose in every colony. Would this new constitution protect liberty or threaten it? Would it unite the states or enslave them to a stronger hand? The revolution had taught the people to distrust power. And now the idea of giving power, even to themselves, frightened them. Those who supported the new plan called themselves Federalists. They believed that unity was strength and that without a central government, the Republic would crumble back into chaos. Among them stood Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, men of intellect and persuasion who began to write. They wrote by candlelight under the name Publius, crafting essays that appeared in newspapers across the states. 85 in all, the Federalist Papers, each one a defense, an explanation, a plea for understanding. Hamilton wrote with fire, Madison wrote with reason, Jay wrote with faith. Together their words formed a bridge between fear and courage, between the fragile dream of freedom and the hard work of preserving it. The accumulation of all powers, Madison warned, in the same hands may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. So they built a system to prevent it, one of checks and balances where each branch would restrain the other, and where the people themselves would remain the final authority. But not all were convinced. Those who opposed the new constitution called themselves anti-federalists. They feared that in giving life to a new government they might also be birthing a new master. They demanded protection, not for the powerful, but for the people. They asked, what is freedom if it can be taken by law?
Their voices were skeptical but not unpatriotic. They were men who had fought a war against empire and now saw empire's shadow in their own creation.
They feared that liberty, once lost, could never be reclaimed. And they were not wrong to be cautious. The Constitution, for all its brilliance, was silent on certain wounds, on slavery, on women, on the native nations who still roamed the frontier. It was a mirror of its time, noble and flawed, luminous and incomplete. To calm these fears, a promise was made, a promise that would become the heart of the American soul. The Bill of Rights, 10 amendments, 10 simple assurances written not in grand language, but in plain human truth, that a man might speak his mind, pray as his conscience guides him, gather with others, petition his leaders, defend his home, and be treated with fairness before the law. It was more than legislation. It was a vow that the government would belong to the governed, not the other way around. The Bill of Rights became the lantern of the Republic, casting light into the corridors of power. It reminded every generation that authority must serve, not rule, that dissent is not treason, but participation. When the states finally ratified the Constitution, the young nation exhaled. From Maine to Georgia, church bells rang once again. People read the news in doorways and markets, as though witnessing a miracle. They had done what no other people had done before, built a government from thought instead of conquest. And though the ink dried in 1789, the ideas within it refused to rest. They were alive, flexible, growing, adapting with each century. It was not a fixed monument, but a living document, breathing with every debate, every amendment, every act of courage that asked, can we be better than before? In that year, as the Constitution took hold, George Washington, reluctant, steady, revered, was called once more from his quiet life at Mount Vernon. The people needed a leader, not a king. They needed someone who would embody the dignity of restraint. When he accepted the presidency, he did so not for glory, but for duty. He had seen war, now he would try peace. And with that, the machinery of the new republic began to hum, slow, uncertain, but alive. The Constitution was more than law, it was a statement of faith. Faith that men, though flawed, could be trusted with their own destiny. Faith that justice, though slow, could triumph over fear. Faith that reason could coexist with compassion and liberty with order. In the years to come, it would be tested by civil war, by greed, by division. Yet it would endure, because it was written not for perfection, but for progress. As you drift into rest, imagine that parchment lying under soft lamplight. The ink faded, the edges curled, the words still alive. Imagine the quills that wrote them, the hands that trembled, the hearts that dared. They could not see our world, but they built it anyway. They could not know the future, but they gave it room to grow.
The Constitution was not just the birth of government.
It was the birth of possibility.
And in its quiet grace, you can still hear the whisper of their faith
that humanity, even in its imperfection, can learn to govern itself with wisdom, mercy, and hope. Chapter 13: The Dawn of Leadership. The war was over. The Constitution was signed, and now, for the first time, a nation waited, breath held, hearts uncertain, for someone to lead it. The year was 1789. The morning of a new century had not yet broken, but the light was changing.
The people had chosen George Washington, not by command, not by birth, but by trust.
He had not asked for the honor, he had never sought power, but duty has a way of finding those who do not chase it. At his home in Mount Vernon, the Potomac River moved slow and silver under the April sun. Washington walked along its banks, hands clasped behind his back, head bowed in thought. He was 57 now, older, quieter, his hair grey with the weight of years. He had seen battle, hunger, triumph, and loss. He wanted rest. But history would not let him sleep. Letters arrived from every state urging him to take the presidency. He read them in silence, his wife Martha watching with knowing eyes. At last, he said softly, "I cannot refuse my country." And so, with reluctant grace, he set out on horseback for New York City, then the temporary capital of the United States. The journey was long, through rain, through cheering crowds, through villages hung with banners of red, white, and blue. Everywhere he passed, bells rang and cannons roared. Farmers stood beside their fields, hats pressed to their chests. Children climbed trees just to glimpse him. To them, Washington was not merely a man. He was the living promise that freedom could be real. When he crossed into each state, he stopped, dismounted, and bowed. He knew the nation was young and that the manner of its first president would set its character. So he carried himself not as a ruler, but as a servant of the people. On April 30th, 1789, the city of New York awoke to clear skies and wind from the harbor. Crowds filled the streets, the air alive with the hum of hope. From the balcony of Federal Hall, Washington stepped forward in a plain brown suit, no crown, no throne, only the sunlight, the flag, and a quiet dignity. He placed his hand upon the Bible and took the oath, "I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will to the best of my ability preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution." The words were simple, but the silence that followed was sacred. The crowd erupted in cheers, but Washington's eyes glistened with humility. He bowed not to the people's applause, but to their faith in him. In that moment, the Republic became real. Not just on parchment, but in practice. Through a man who believed that power must always bow to principle. His presidency began without blueprint or precedent. Every decision he made would become the measure for those who came after. He formed the cabinet, Jefferson as Secretary of State, Hamilton as Treasury, Knox as War, Randolph as Attorney General. Together they debated the great questions of governance, how to pay the nation's debts, how to unite the states, how to balance freedom with order.
Their differences were sharp.
Jefferson dreamed of a nation of farmers, humble, self-reliant, bound to the soil. Hamilton envisioned one of industry and strength, a nation of trade and finance standing equal to Europe's powers. Washington stood between them, the still point in a storm of ideas. He listened more than he spoke, and when he finally spoke, his words carried the calm of mountains. He knew that unity was fragile as the parchment on which the Constitution was written. So he governed with patience, seeking balance over brilliance, peace over pride. But leadership is not just decisions, it is example. Washington refused to be treated as a monarch. He walked through the streets without guard.
He invited citizens to his home.
He ended each meeting with the same quiet reminder: we are all Americans. When foreign wars erupted in Europe, he chose neutrality, believing that the young nation must first learn to stand before it could run. His restraint became a lesson that strength sometimes lies not in action, but in stillness. After 2 terms, when the people begged him to stay, he refused. He stepped down voluntarily, the first leader in modern history to give up power freely. His farewell address, printed in newspapers across the land, read not as a command, but as a father's letter to his children. He warned against the divisions of political parties, against the dangers of foreign entanglements, against the corruption of ambition. He urged unity, virtue, and humility, the quiet virtues that hold nations together when noise and pride threaten to tear them apart. Then he went home, back to Mount Vernon, back to the river, to the land, to the peace he had earned. In the years that followed, others would rule, some wisely, some not. The nation would grow, stumble, and rise again.
But none would ever lead quite like him.
Because George Washington had given America its most enduring lesson that true leadership is not about command, but about character. As you drift into rest, imagine that morning on Federal Hall, the sunlight on his face, the murmur of the crowd, the pages of the Bible fluttering in the breeze. No crown, no throne, only a man and a promise. And as the wind moved through the city streets, it carried the breath of something new. A government born not from fear, but from faith. The dawn of leadership had come, and beneath that dawn, a young nation finally stood. Chapter 14. The stillness of a new beginning. The story of a nation rarely ends. It only pauses, like a breath between heartbeats, a silence between 2 waves. By the dawn of the 1790s, the United States of America had begun to stand, unsteady, imperfect, yet alive. The fields that once echoed with gunfire now whispered with the hum of plows. Children who had known only war now grew up under peace, and somewhere along the Potomac, the new capital was being planned, a city that would carry the name of the man who refused to be king. The dream had survived. It had begun with whispers, the first footsteps across ice, the first sails through fog, the first fires of settlers in a wilderness untamed. It had passed through hands that built and broke, through voices that argued and believed. It had endured famine, tyranny, revolution, and doubt. And yet, through all the noise, one quiet truth remained: that the human heart, when given the chance, reaches always for freedom. That is how America was born. Not through conquest, but through conviction. Not in a single day, but over generations of patience and pain. In his final years, George Washington returned to his farm, tending the same soil he had walked as a young man. He rose with the dawn, wrote letters by candlelight, and rode among his fields as the seasons turned.
He no longer commanded armies or signed decrees.
He simply lived, and in that living he taught his final lesson. That power, when held with humility, becomes peace. That greatness, when surrendered, becomes grace. Visitors came from all over the young country to see him. Soldiers who had marched with him, citizens who had never met him, children who called him Father of the Nation. He welcomed them all with the same quiet kindness. And when he died, in the cold of December 1799, bells rang across the land. Churches draped their pulpits in black. Farmers stopped in their fields. The nation mourned, not as subjects for a ruler, but as children for a parent. In that silence, America grew older. The years that followed would not be easy. There would be division, discovery, injustice, and change. The Constitution would be tested. The ideals of freedom would stumble and rise again. New voices would join the song, immigrants, inventors, dreamers, reformers, each adding their own note to the unfinished melody. Because that was the promise hidden within the first idea that a nation, like a soul, is never complete. It must keep becoming. If you could stand now on the shores of time and look back, you would see not the perfection of a plan, but the endurance of a hope. The light of campfires fading into cities.
The sound of quills replaced by printing presses, and printing presses by the hum of electricity.
And still beneath it all the same pulse, liberty, fragile, stubborn, shining. From the icy silence of the Bering Land Bridge to the roar of the Liberty Bell, from the small hands that planted corn to the trembling hands that signed a declaration, it was always the same story. The human longing to be free, to belong, to believe. Freedom is not a flag or a border. It is a quiet thing, a seed planted in the heart. And like every seed, it grows in silence before it blooms. As night falls over this story, imagine the land itself. Mountains resting under snow, rivers whispering to the sea, fields turning golden beneath a low sun. Imagine the stars above, the same stars that watched over the first people, the explorers, the soldiers, the founders. They have seen it all, and yet they still shine with patient wonder, because history too is a kind of night sky. Vast, filled with darkness, yet scattered with light. And somewhere within that light, one small constellation still flickers. The story of a nation that began as a dream that became a promise that became a people. So now close your eyes, let the centuries fade like mist. Let the noise of war and argument dissolve into wind. What remains is the heartbeat. Slow, steady, human. It is the sound of America. Still young, still learning, still alive. And as the stars drift overhead, the land sleeps. Peaceful, imperfect, enduring, in the stillness of a new beginning. Epilogue, a reflection. Across time. History does not end. It simply changes its voice. From the sound of drums to the hum of cities, from the clash of swords to the soft pulse of electricity, from parchment to pixel, from ink to thought. And yet, beneath all those changes, the same story continues. The human longing to be free, to belong, to create something that endures beyond the self. The United States was born from that longing, not as a perfect nation, but as a living question. Can people govern themselves with wisdom and mercy? It is a question still being answered.
Every generation rewrites part of the answer.
In protest and in peace, in invention and in art, in courage and in failure. Each person who walks its land adds a single note to the unfinished symphony of its becoming. The music rises and falls, sometimes discord, sometimes harmony,
but always moving toward light.
If you listen closely tonight, you can still hear echoes of the past in the wind, the murmur of the first rivers, the crackle of campfires in Jamestown, the quill against parchment in Philadelphia, the quiet oath whispered beneath the open sky. All those sounds have become the heartbeat of a nation, and perhaps of something larger,
the spirit of humanity itself, learning slowly
how to live together in freedom without forgetting kindness.
So rest now, traveler.
The story is still unfolding, but for tonight, it sleeps beneath the stars. The rivers still run, the flag still waves. And somewhere in the silence between centuries, the dream still breathes. Softly, steadily, like the pulse of the earth itself. Sleep well. Tomorrow, history begins again. End of How the United States Was Formed, From the Dawn of the Land to the First President.